Welcome back to another class of Design for Health, which is a new class from the Stanford University School of Medicine on how design can impact innovation in healthcare. Today's topic is designing with empathy, and I'm really excited to have Annie Valdez, who is a senior project lead in the health and wellness practice at IDEO, here as our guest lecturer. And our e-patient speaker who's going to kick things off today is Richard Anderson. I've known Richard for 3 years now, and he is Stanford MedX e-patient scholar, as well as someone who has helped move user experience and human-centered design into a position of greater influence in numerous organizations and countries. He has held multiple management roles and has been a consultant for nearly 20 years. And just so you know, for those of you at home, we really like to start out each of our classes in this series with the story from a patient, because we believe that patients can have a great role to play in innovation in healthcare. So we are going to hear from Richard and Annie very shortly, but first, while Richard's getting his slides set up, a quick message on video for you guys, and we'll see you right here after the break. If you are joining us for the first time, a quick reminder that there is a simultaneous conversation happening on Twitter right now using the hashtag MedX. Christopher Snyder is the in-class moderator for today's program and will be taking questions from social media. So please make sure to start up your Twitter client to join in the online conversation and interact with today's speakers. Christopher Snyder, otherwise known as I Am Spartacus, is moderating the online tweet chat discussion this evening. We also wish to remind you that registration for Medicine X 2014 is now open. Don't miss the year's premier patient-centered conference on emerging technology and medicine. Unique opportunities such as our masterclass program and our IDEO Design Challenge workshop have extremely limited space availability. You'll want to take advantage of these programs while our early bird registration pricing is still available until May 1st, 2014. Please also make sure to like our Facebook page at www.facebook.com/Stanford MedX. Please note, you are watching a live online program and there is a delay between real-time events and the live stream you are watching. Tweets from our in-class guests will appear before you see the real-time events they are tweeting about unfold on the video live stream.
I've managed groups of people who do that work, and I've taught many others how to do it. Developing empathy is instrumental to a human-centered design process. And some of the most important empathy that I've developed in my life was developed right here in this building at 3 wonderful conferences, Medicine 2.0 in 2011 and Medicine X in 2012 and 2013. I had the great fortune of being an e-patient scholar, as Larry mentioned, at all 3, and all 3 were incredible experiences, indeed truly invaluable. I even became a member of Regina Holliday's Walking Gallery of Healthcare here in this building, which alone is hard to beat. On the screen is a photo of Regina painting my jacket, and to the right you can see what she painted, which is an image that captures the essence of my patient's story. I'm wearing that jacket today, so you can take a closer look at it later. It is also here that I met other patients who, like me, had bad experiences with the healthcare system, and were here to tell their stories. The many benefits of meeting and interacting with other patients online are being well documented, but for me, nothing compares with meeting and hearing from such people in person. I made connections with other people here that will last my lifetime, and I continue to hear more of their stories and read more about their frustrations, such as those on the screen communicated via Twitter by Sarah Kucharski. My empathy and appreciation for other patients have soared because of these experiences. At last year's Medicine X, fellow e-patient scholar Hugo Campos commented on how I had changed since the 2011 conference, how I was now happy and talkative, and how in 2011 I was quiet and seemingly angry. Well, I was angry, and I was very angry. I was less than trusting of people, because in 2011 I was much closer in time to the worst part of my patient story, which was a major, major nightmare. My patient's story is long and complicated, so I can't come close to recounting it here, but it included wild, semi-conscious seizures, loss of memory about how to do simple tasks, and so much more. I tried to fight through it all to get help, but I learned very quickly that the healthcare system was not going to provide it. Indeed, my complaints about the US healthcare system are many, which I also don't have time to detail, but my bottom line complaints are that I nearly lost my freedom and all my dignity, and I nearly lost my life, all unnecessarily. And that pissed me off. And it was that anger that prompted me to make a public commitment to doing what I can do to reduce the chances that others experience what I experienced. I began this quest by documenting what I knew, much of that being writing about my patient experience in a blog, images of which you've seen on the screen. Some people cautioned me that I was revealing things that might eventually come back to haunt me, but I chose to be open so that my writing could potentially benefit me and benefit others. As I was writing, I continued to look for help regarding my condition, and the internet was key to this search. I attempted to contact medical personnel who might also be of help, but my efforts were greatly hindered by medical rules and a medical culture that hindered me earlier and were not designed to be patient-centered. Like a good designer, I began to investigate these rules and that culture to try to find out why they existed. To put it differently, I began to attempt to develop empathy for the medical personnel I had encountered and had come to greatly dislike. My investigation included reading very revealing articles like this one and hearing very revealing TED Talks by some very bold doctors, including Jay Parkinson, Brian Goldman, and Stanford's own Abraham Verghese. Oh, how wonderful it was to later get a chance to hear from and meet some of these people in person at the 3 conferences that I attended here in 2011, 2012, and 2013. I learned lots from these doctors that might have otherwise taken me a long time to learn. Brian Goldman's words should give you an idea of the kinds of things that I learned. I'll let you read that. But my research went further, courtesy of many medical appointments. For example, I was able to observe a doctor on multiple occasions throw tantrums about the old and then the new electronic medical record system he was being forced to use. And I was able to talk with him about the reasons for his extreme frustration as he experienced it. I also investigated the various ways people were proposing to change some of the medical rules and culture, ways which included, interestingly enough, giving physicians training in developing empathy for their patients. I also investigated what designers weren't always doing very well in healthcare design, and I began to write and speak about what I was learning, directing most of this writing and speaking to designers in the healthcare field. On the screen appears references to a subset of the places where either I or my writing has appeared. I also participated in several local design jams, including some put on by the Stanford D School. I encourage designers to look for and take advantage of these opportunities as they make you better able to apply design thinking to solving the challenging problems that exist in healthcare. Finally, I was so motivated by my wonderful conference experiences here that I wanted to provide related experiences for others on an ongoing basis. Hence, I'm in the process of launching a local meetup group that initially was just for e-patients, but is in the process of morphing into the first local chapter of the Society for Participatory Medicine. Developing empathy is among the chapter's goals. Yes, I've developed significant empathy for doctors and patients alike, and I've been very lucky to mostly regain my health, and I've regained my sense of humor, though I don't think you got a chance to experience that in my short talk here this evening. But I am still angry. My patient nightmare has not necessarily reached its conclusion, and it should have long ago. The US healthcare system failed me, and it continues to fail large numbers of others unnecessarily. Indeed, that is no laughing matter. Thank you for listening.
If you are joining us for the first time,
The warm-up. Our major speaker for this evening, whom Larry referred to earlier, Annie Valdez, is a senior project lead and design strategist at IDEO, an award-winning global design consultancy that takes a human-centered, design-based approach to helping organizations innovate and grow. Annie has tackled complex challenges like patient empowerment and engagement, workplace well-being and design for aging. Her passions include designing for difficult life transitions, the evolving world of peer-to-peer healthcare, yes, and she's currently obsessed with exploring new models around caregiver support. She has worked with a wide variety of clients, including complex hospital systems, Steelcase, Google, the NFL Players Association, and pharmaceutical companies like Novartis and Eli Lilly. Annie's work also touches the public sector, including her work with the California Healthcare Foundation to design the enrollment experience for the Affordable Care Act. But before we hear from Annie, we're going to have a quick message for you from Executive Director of Medicine X, Dr. Larry Chu. We will be right back.
If you are joining us for the first time, a quick reminder that there is a simultaneous conversation happening on Twitter right now using the hashtag MedX. Christopher Snyder is the in-class moderator for today's program and will be taking questions from social media. So please make sure to start up your Twitter client to join in the online conversation and interact with today's speakers. Christopher Snyder, otherwise known as I Am Spartacus, is moderating the online tweet chat discussion this evening. We also wish to remind you that registration for Medicine X 2014 is now open. Don't miss the year's premier patient-centered conference on emerging technology and medicine. Unique opportunities such as our masterclass program and our IDEO Design Challenge workshop have extremely limited space availability. You'll want to take advantage of these programs while our early bird registration pricing is still available until May 1st, 2014. Please also make sure to like our Facebook page at www.facebook.com/Stanford MedX. Please note, you are watching a live online program and there is a delay between real-time events and the live stream you are watching. Tweets from our in-class guests will appear before you see the real-time events they are tweeting about unfold on the video live stream.
Who were here last week, you actually got to hear my colleague Dennis Boyle talk about the overall design thinking process. And fortunately, he set the stage for me to dive really deep into the part of the process that I play the most often in. My name's Annie Valdez, and I work at IDEO. And a little context for you. I'm fascinated by cultural context. I grew up with a mom who is watching, who turned me on to anthropology. So I studied anthropology very early in school, loved the idea of studying other cultures and how people experience the world, and became a web developer, because that's what you do when you study anthropology. You go straight into web development. But I was self-taught, and along the way, I discovered human-centered design. And the reason I found human-centered design was because I was getting asked to make web pages for people when it didn't really seem like that was exactly what they needed. And so I discovered that if you really tried to understand what people were trying to do, you could design better. But if you really understood kind of the bigger question behind what they were trying to accomplish, you might actually discover that what they need isn't what you were asked to create for them. And so you start to question your assumptions and really ask bigger and broader questions. And that's what I do now for a living. The reason I got to where I am now is that in doing this in kind of expanding my view into design, I actually went and got an MBA. So I went back and thought, okay, if I'm going to get design earlier into a process, get design brought, first question, trying to understand what users need, I need to speak business. And so I actually went and got an MBA so that I could speak business and bring design earlier into the process. So that's a lot of background to say that I am now at IDEO. I've been at IDEO for 10 years. My job is, describe myself as a design researcher, a design strategist, a project lead. It depends on who I'm talking to, but my job is to be inspired. And one of our creative directors has told me this, and I've internalized it. It's my job to be inspired, and it's my job to help our team see the world with fresh eyes, because fresh eyes and inspiration, it's how you get to new thinking, new ways of viewing the world. And so I do this with the health practice, which means I work on projects that touch on healthcare, that touch on well-being, pretty much anything having to do with helping people, tap their potential and basically just live a quality life. So design. Let's talk a little bit about design briefly. There's a lot of experiences in the world that aren't intentionally designed, and they're painful. Think about You're going into the BART station or the Muni station and you're running. You're going to miss the train and you get to this. You see these two machines. You have to go literally from one machine to the other to get exact change for the train. It's madness. People aren't really thinking about what you need at that moment in time. That's a lack of empathy. That's a lack of thinking about what the user needs when they're in that moment. And I personally have a very strongly held belief that it doesn't have to be like this. Now, you're all here because you touch the health space or you're interested in design for health, and I'm so excited by that because really, health doesn't have to suck. A lot of experiences suck, and we can actually do something about it, and design can help do that. And my mom just heard me say that things suck. Sorry, Mom. Okay, so IDEO. To give you a little background, if you did miss Dennis's talk, I'll go super brief. We are a human-centered design consultancy, and we basically help organizations think about ways to grow. And we do that by helping them look at the world in new ways, thinking about their business in new ways. And as Dennis said, we pretty much do everything but tobacco and guns, because there's not really any problem in the world that design couldn't help have a hand in solving. There's no one correct way to get to innovation. I'm glad to see people approaching innovation and trying things with a new perspective. You can come from the business perspective. Does this make sense viably? Is there a business model behind this? You can go from a technical perspective. Is this thing feasible? Is it possible? Or you can go from humans. Is this what people want? Is this something that people need? Personally, this is where I start. This is where my company starts. We start with this belief that if you start with what matters to people, what they need, you'll get something sticky. You'll get something more compelling. And then as you go, you incorporate the other lenses to make sure that you've got something that's solid. Ultimately, we're designers, and we're inspired by people. And that's, to me, what empathy is all about. It's really about looking out into the world and understanding the perspective of people. So when I say empathy, let me give a few caveats. So first off, there's no one correct way to get empathy. There's no one path to it. It starts with a willingness and a mindset. And I want to talk a little bit about what that mindset is. So first, it's really about understanding the world from another's perspective. And this is my nephew. If I were designing for him, I would need to understand what matters to him. What's his context? What are his priorities? And you think, oh, well, he's just a little kid. His opinion doesn't matter. And that's actually not true. And that's actually what ends up happening with patients and anybody in the healthcare system, the world. People's perspectives need to be understood so that we can really figure out what are the key essential moments that we need to tune up or tune down and really fine tune to get them right. And ultimately, we use this perspective to inform what we design and how we design it. So we always say that great designs are based on great insights about real people. Now, you could just start with that and be very inspired and be very excited about the world, but you could also spin in circles because there's so much going on in the world. You need to focus. And so part of what I wanted to talk about today was how do we look? How do we actually start to filter the world to figure out what's going to get us the kind of empathy that we need to design something new and different that's going to help the people that we're designing for? So constraints are actually a really wonderful thing because they help you kind of focus your attention into the world. Also, when you're doing research, I describe it as research because that's my hat that I wear. It's design research. It's always in the service of design. It's not just going out and trying to understand what's interesting to people, what hurts, what are horrible aspects of an experience. If it's not really what you're designing for, what you're solving for, it's a great exercise, but unfortunately, it's misspent energy. You really need to think about what's the problem we're trying to solve, and then how do we inform ourselves so that we can come with a new approach. And we have to get beyond what people say to understand what matters to them. And this one's really important because people think that, well, if I just talk to people, I can just get the answer. I can just ask them directly the question. But the more that you go out and speak to people, the more you realize that actually what they say doesn't always represent what they think or actually how they feel. And so you have to do a combination of talking to people, observing people, and trying to figure out ways to get into their head to understand what really matters to them so that you can have the right priorities. So in the old days, I'm going to date myself for a second. I've been at IDEO 10 years. When I first started at IDEO, empathy kind of happened at the beginning of the design process. It was something that you did at the beginning, and then you moved into ideation, and then you moved into building out the idea. And the pendulum has swung back and forth a few times where there's a lot more design going on, there's a lot more research going on, And I think now we're at a really nice place in the design world where research and design are actually starting to find a nice rhythm. So we're constantly in this iterating cycle of learning about who we're designing for, trying something, designing it, getting their feedback, going back out into the world. And so we're constantly learning and we're doing. And that happens throughout the entire process. So empathy doesn't end once we're done having our initial conversations. Empathy happens all throughout, just like design happens from day one. So who do we talk to? Again, there's lots of really cool, fascinating people in the world, but where do we begin? Especially, you guys, do you have a sense of even who you're going to reach out to and who you're going to speak to? Probably not. It might seem a little overwhelming. So I'll give you a couple ways to think about this. So first off, probably want to look for people who aren't like you. That might seem obvious, but there are a couple reasons why that's important. You have your own preconceived ideas about a space, and that's going to limit what your view of potential solutions might be. So you need to seek out people who think differently than you. They're going to come up with things you wouldn't even think to consider as important factors. This guy here was, this gentleman, we were studying the Tokyo Metro. We were studying the subway system in Japan, and we wanted to understand what did a blind user want in the experience? How did they actually navigate the system, and what actually mattered to them? And the kind of things that stood out to him surprised the heck out of the team. He has limited vision, and he talked about how he loved distinctive stations. He loved stations that had a personality. He loved those moments on his train ride where the sun could kind of shine through the windows in the tunnels, and he kind of felt the warmth on his face. And it was a really physical, visceral experience that I think the entire team was really inspired by and excited by. But if we had just gone in looking kind of through our own lenses, we wouldn't have noticed that because we're not as tuned into the physical environment around us beyond maybe what we might see or hear. You also want to understand not just the person you're designing for, but the people around them. So this is an example of the kind of exercise we'll do with people where we'll have them map out the ecosystem of people who matter to them. Who are the influencers? Who are the people they talk to? What are the relationships? Are they strong? Are they weak? Now, when we're doing our projects at IDEO, we're designing for the patient, but we're also designing for the other stakeholders, because if we're designing something just for the patient and no one else in the health ecosystem can use what we've designed, it's a dead end. So we have to really understand what these dependencies are. More and more, we're designing systems. And I know a bunch of you are actually really excited about changing systems and really mucking with the way the healthcare system works, which is so exciting. So in order to be able to understand what levers are at your disposal, you have to dive in a little bit deeper and dig into understand different elements. And so just some of you are looking at this going, what am I looking at? This was a project we did in Kenya. So we were looking at improved drinking water in rural Kenya. And we needed to understand not just the end users, but who are the intermediaries? Who are the providers? Who are the organizations that are actually providing health education and having influence over the people in the villages we were designing for? Because those were all potential avenues for us to engage. You can't talk to everyone, right? If you tried to talk to everyone in the ecosystem, you could spend all your time and you wouldn't actually get to start designing. And so really what you want to think about is creating a patchwork of perspectives. So a little bit of the macro scale of culture, a little bit of what's going, or probably more of what's happening at the individual level. And then more often than not, what you're doing is going to have some relationship to an organization. So maybe you're designing something for Stanford Hospital. Maybe you're a startup and you're creating something on your own. Either way, there's going to be a blend of the perspectives of the organization you're designing with and then the perspectives of the people that you're actually designing for. So I'll spend a little bit more time talking about the bottom left quadrant, which is analogs, extremes, and core. That's basically, when I think about that quadrant, it's about who is that end user, that person, that patient, depending on who the perspective is. So first off, there's the core. There's the people who fit the target of what you're trying to do, and maybe they have some sort of profile of maybe they have a certain health condition, or they do or don't engage in a program that you're trying to design or strengthen. But you also want to get behind the core. Or beyond the core. Because if you look at something what we call extreme users, you actually start to reveal perspectives that they're much more magnified than what you might see in the core. And I'll give you a couple examples of that. But think about as the people who are completely unfamiliar with the product or the experience, or the people who are extremely familiar with the product or experience. And the reason that's interesting is that because they're so far to the end of the spectrum, they might actually be more articulate about things that exist along the middle that maybe folks in the middle might not be able to articulate. And so again, since we're looking for inspiration, we're looking for those nuggets that we can jump off of. So an example of this would be, in the quantified self movement, people who wear these bracelets and these trackers, there's a whole spectrum of them, of folks trying these different devices. It's questionable whether or not these devices are working. It's questionable whether or not the behaviors are sticking. But if we're really trying to understand how do we change it and how do we design better devices, maybe we'd talk to somebody who just doesn't believe in technology. They don't believe in tracking. They don't believe in anything that's really not the tangible, physical, face-to-face interaction. You could also talk to an extreme self-tracker, so somebody who tracks everything. And I'm sure you guys have heard the stories of people who weigh their poo, right? There's extreme self-trackers out there. You might want to talk to them to understand, what are they trying to accomplish and why are they so motivated to go and weigh their poo, right? It's not a really mainstream type of behavior. I love the cringes. Okay, good. There's another type of interaction or observation that we describe as analogous behaviors, or analogous users, sorry. Dennis spoke about this a little last week, but I wanted to just dive in a little bit more to just show you a couple ways to use that perspective for a couple reasons. One is that you might not always be able to talk to people, to as many people as you want about a given topic. Maybe because there's not that many people in the world facing a specific situation, or you're designing something that's completely new, and so you have to be creative about where you get your inspiration. So this is an example from one of my hands down favorite project I've ever worked on in 10 years, the NFL Players Association. So they had hired us to look at, what happens when these players, when they get through their careers and they have this transition to retirement. Within 5 years, a lot of bad things happen. These guys are not in a good way. How can the NFL Players Association support them? What kind of services might they need to kind of keep these guys buoyant? Which, it's a holistic wellness problem. There's financial well-being, there's physical well-being. You've got issues of concussions, but then you've also got social and emotional issues. Just talk about what happened a few years ago with all of the suicides, right? So there's a lot going on. So we really needed to understand, okay, what's happening with these guys and why do they need so much support? So one analog, which pretty straightforward analog, was, well, where else do we have teams? Where else do we have this brotherhood, this camaraderie? Where else do we have this in the trenches kind of feeling where you've got this tight bond and then suddenly it ends and you don't really know who your peer group is or how to connect with them? Soldiers, right? Pretty straightforward. It's kind of an obvious one. But what if we looked at it from a different perspective? What if we looked at it and said, part of what's hard about this transition is that football is an identity that they have had with them their entire lives. They have had this day in and day out. All their lives they wanted to be, the big pro football star, and then now that's over. Not all of them have a plan B. What do we do with that? Or, my friends, when they look at me and they talk to me, they see me as the football guy, and that's not who I am anymore. Or, I see me as the football guy, and that's not who I am anymore. Aha, really hard to navigate. So, we're based in the Bay Area. We got a little creative. We thought, well, transgender, folks who are going through gender reassignment surgery, they're dealing with this identity crisis every day themselves. What could we learn if we talked to somebody who is going through this process themselves? And so we, took a leap, said, well, we didn't know if this was going to be entirely relevant, but we went and we spoke to somebody who was going through the reassignment process. And he, formerly she, was fantastic, told us all about, all my whole life. My whole life I knew something wasn't quite right, but I had this series of revelations where I started to realize who I was and what was right for me. And I mean, like a bolt of lightning, you hear stories like this, right? But like a bolt of lightning, in the middle of the conversation, I had this aha, you fool! You've been thinking about transitions as in or out. And actually, what makes these things so hard is that they're a series of transitions over time, but it seems like it's this in or out. So there's this disconnect in how we talk to people and how we support them, which was fascinating because it changed everything about the project. Looking at the question and looking at the problem in a new way, it changed how we thought about, when do you support somebody who's kind of going through this career change? How do you reach out to them? What kind of support do they even need? So it was just profound for the project. So kind of a fan, analogous, great technique. Some of the other things that, obviously, okay, hopefully you guys are convinced, you realize, yes, empathy, I get it, I'm bought in. Larry's telling me I got to go talk to somebody next week. What do I start to do? Wanted to talk a little bit about some of the mindsets that we bring into this process, just that help us really go in and get the most out of our experiences. So first off, you got to be humble. There's this, you need to have a willingness to admit that you could be wrong, that your assumptions might not be right, that maybe the solutions that you think are the right solutions, they might not work because you're going to be putting them out there and getting responses from people. But you also have to go in and try and put aside all of your assumptions and just listen and absorb and just experience what you're experiencing so you actually have time or have room to get this new perspective. We also have to build trust. It's our responsibility when we're setting up these interactions with people. We have to create a safe space because we're asking them to get really vulnerable. We're asking them to often talk about very personal things they've never spoken about to anyone else. We're asking them to maybe tell us about an experience that could have been painful in their lives. And it's crucial that they get that we respect them and that we are completely open to what they're sharing with us and that we're not going to judge them for it. And it can be harder than you think, so you have to practice it. But there's ways that we build rapport. And the ways that we build rapport vary depending on who we're talking to. So this is Tegan. Tegan, like most kids, pretty active. Sitting still isn't really at the top of her resume. She likes to keep moving. And we found that, the team that went out and spoke with Tegan, they sat down with her and they sat outside and they had a coloring book. And, they warmed up. They colored with her. It felt more like a play date. They asked her questions about, what does she like at school? And, what are her favorite things? And what's she proud of? And kind of easing her in because you have to build comfort. You have to get to the point where people are actually comfortable opening up with you. If they don't open up, you're not going to get anything. And so you actually have to invest before you can get to the heart of what you're trying to talk about. Now, if we were talking to somebody else, maybe not Tegan, maybe somebody 60, 70 years older than Tegan, a play date might not be the right tone. So you have to really figure out what's the context. Am I going to someone who has 7 people living in their house? Is an in-home interview going to be helpful to that conversation, or is it actually going to make it awkward? You have to think about what that context is. We've been doing a lot more of creating relationships. And the distinction I make between building trust and creating relationships is that no longer are we just going into projects and having a one-time conversation with someone and never going back to them. That will happen. But what happens more often than not now is we're going back to people over the course of a project and we're checking back in with them. And we're taking prototypes with them. And we're checking back in on just, hey, how are things going? How has your thinking evolved over this topic? And part of that, it's beneficial in 2 ways. One is it helps the people that we're, our participants. This is George from the football project. It gave George an opportunity to reflect, but also feel like he had ownership over this content. He actually felt invested, like he helped create this thing, which made the content better, to be honest. It also helped us because we got to know George, and we got to see our perspective on George change over time, and it gave us some distance and perspective to help us, fine-tune how we interacted with our players and the tone of voice we used in, our communications materials for the ultimate program. So you're going to have conversations. When you think about the conversations, again, you can't just go straight for the jugular. You can't just walk in and be like, hi, I'm here to talk about erectile dysfunction. That's not going to work. It's going to be really awkward. It's not even going to work if you're trying to talk to somebody about credit cards because they're going to anticipate what you're trying to, what you think or what they think you want to hear. So they'll try and second guess you. You actually have to ground this in, hey, I'm here, Suzanne, to talk to you. Sorry to put you on the spot. I'm here to talk to you because I really want to understand your perspective, not what other people think, but really what matters to you so that we can design something better for you. And it gets personal. So we start by understanding who's this person, what's their context, what matters to them, and we circle in on ultimately the topic we want to talk about. And stories are valuable data. Again, if you frame your questions too broadly, people will tell you facts. They'll tell you things like how long they've lived somewhere and how many people live in their house and how often do they go to the doctor. But what they won't tell you is that the reason they don't take the medication is because they don't really think that the doctor gets them. They don't really see themselves as someone who is pre-diabetic, and they reject the diagnosis. And because they reject the diagnosis, they don't believe that the therapy is for them. And so that's not about education. That's not about teaching them how to take the medication, because if they just knew how to take the medication, they would take it. It's about understanding what this person actually, how they're engaging with their health and what they need to hear. So some of the techniques we use that might be helpful for you, all of you, something like 5 whys. So, why did you do this? And then, dig in a little bit more. And what happens by digging in a series of asking why kind of in succession, it helps people articulate something they might have never had to articulate before. So it might give them an opportunity to articulate their biases, their assumptions, some of the mental models that they have that they've never had to articulate before. Same thing with show me. Can you show me how you do this? Because again, if people were to tell you what they did, they would leave out some crucial steps. So if you're designing an app, a digital tool, and you had somebody describe a process to you, what they describe and what you'd actually need to do in the user flow would be totally different. You actually need to get them to walk you through a process. Naive questions are helpful, and they're really tricky. If you take a client into the field with you and you don't warn them that you're going to ask naive questions, they get really worried that you don't know what you're doing. So it's actually a blend of you kind of know what you're asking about, but you're trying to understand the other person's mental model. You're trying to understand how they think about it. If they're wrong, it's not our job to correct them. It's our job to understand, why do you think that? Or how'd you get that opinion? Or how'd you get that perspective? We're just trying to understand how they see the world so that we can design a world that complements theirs. Conversations are only going to get you so far. And so asking is just one piece of it. I love tools. So tools is just, I love to have probes and prompts and that sort of thing in my field work. So the way we use something like tools is, first off, if it's an uncomfortable topic, it gives people something to talk to. It gives them something to do. So the conversation isn't just you and me having this kind of awkward discussion about that, that thing that you don't want to talk to anybody in your family about. It's an opportunity to understand priorities and preferences, because ultimately we're going to have to design stuff. And when we design things, we're going to have to make trade-offs. And the worst thing in the world is to make trade-offs based on just what the funder wants or what the technology allows. What you want is you want to make trade-offs based on what the user needs, what their priorities are, because that's how you get to the interesting new stuff. Other things we have is, we'll have people do collages, or we'll have people do home tours, because that might help us understand, how do you organize things and what are the relationships between them. We also want to give people ways to participate. And part of how you do that is it goes beyond body language. It goes beyond what you say. It also goes to, the probes and prompts that you're providing. Do they actually invite people to participate? Do they say, hey, I want you to give me your perspective? So a couple things that we do that do this are we leave blanks. We leave room for somebody to fill in the rest of the story. We give them tools to participate. I've seen people we do a lot of internal-facing observations with clients, and they'll ask for feedback, but then they won't put a pen near the place where they're asking for the feedback. How am I supposed to write something down when there's no whiteboard marker and there's none in the building? You don't really want to hear what I have to say. Leave it blank. Let them fill in the story. Encourage them to that you want to hear their perspective. The gold for design work and for designing with empathy is getting to the emotions. And it's hard for people to just off the cuff, it's hard for people who aren't me to just off the cuff start talking about their emotions. I could go deep if you really wanted to, but I'll spare you. So we'll use tools that help us with that. So for example, what you see here is you see my colleague Sina talking to a former player, and there's an exercise here that asks him to map out his career. And there's big milestones in the career. And we asked this player to help us understand what was he thinking at different stages at those different milestones. What were the emotions that were going on? So we have little drawings of faces, and he could circle them and he can write them in. And that can be tricky, because I've had conversations with colleagues where we've talked about the interviews we've had with surgeons, right? Surgeons, nothing ever goes wrong in a surgery. I'm never nervous. I'm never anxious. The cool thing is that when you do something like that, don't have a lot of the confident and cocky ones. Once they run out of those, they're going to have to use some of the negative emotions, so you can start to probe for, well, when do you ever feel this way? When do you ever feel uncomfortable? Or when do you ever feel like you second guess your abilities, or whatever you're trying to explore? The other thing that we've done to help get to emotions is think about, what's the tone? Who are the people in a system that could help kind of provide the support that you might need? So an example for this is, we had cards here with different roles and different personas. So, when you first got cut, did you want a brother? Did you want a dad? Did you want a coach? Who's the person you needed at that moment in time? The same thing applies for, when you got diagnosed, what kind of role did you want the doctor to play versus the nurse? That sort of thing. Context really matters. So we really want to understand, as much as possible, where's this person coming from? What's the reality of their life? And the more that you can get that firsthand perspective, the more that you'll see things that the person you're talking to can't articulate. They can't explicitly express, what's on their mind and what's frustrating for them. The other cool thing that happens when you actually go into the field and get to know a person and see their space is that you internalize some of what matters to them. So when you start to design, you'll say, would Dimitri really use this? I mean, his kitchen's this big. We're really designing this like self-cleaning robotic whatever. That's not going to work in his setting. And so you start to defend the work on the user's behalf instead of just because you're in love with the idea. Other things that we look for that I think Dennis touched on a little bit, so I won't go into too much detail, but what do they care about? Where do you see a lot of investment, like pictures on the wall, or a lavish display of their shoes because they love their shoes, or are they ashamed of their medication so it's hidden away, or are they is it so all-consuming that they've got a system in place and it dominates the entire house? What's their body language when they talk about certain topics? What are some of the triggers that cue behavior, whether it be in their home or in an environment? You can also look for invisible tensions. We do this a lot when we're going and trying to understand what the culture of an organization might be. So for example, when we're touring a hospital or a clinic or a plant, right? This is at a manufacturing facility, and they're saying, oh yeah, morale is really high, but you see all these really snarky, passive-aggressive notes written on things, like people are kind of upset, but no one ever says anything. It's kind of awesome. Can you watch a process unfold? Can you see something happen? Look for opportunities to just observe and see what you notice. What's the environment like? What are the behaviors that you're seeing? This is two nurses at a hospital coordinating schedules for all the different staff members. And they're saying that they have this paperless process, but everything we saw was paper-based, paper-based, paper-based. But they had this really awesome paperless process. If we hadn't seen that, we would totally believe that they had this awesome paperless process. You could also bring context with you. You can't always go to someone's home, so could you take it with you and could you actually recreate the context? So maybe people who have a shared condition, they can actually have an opportunity to comment on what do they see when they're in the store. When you hear these stories, you want to make time to synthesize them. Look for patterns. What do we see? What is the larger arc? How do we bring that into what we're trying to design? And these patterns can actually help you understand who are the types of people we're designing for. What are the kinds of interactions we might want to orchestrate so that we can serve different kinds of needs? This is just two examples of an exercise I love to do, which is, like before you joined the league, how did you think pro football was going to be? Once you're in the league, what was it like actually? And then what do you think, these are for guys who are still in the league, what do you think it's going to be like when you get out, right? And this is a really worrying thing, right? He has no idea. So you can start to speak to that. You can start to design for kind of those gaps in knowledge and expectations. You can also help others internalize the insights. Now that you've kind of tapped into what the needs are, this is an example of designing for taboo. Does anybody know what the store is? I know it's a pixelated photo. This is Good Vibrations. This is a sex shop in San Francisco. We were designing for digestive health, and we wanted our client to understand, what happens when somebody has an uncomfortable question. What's it like to have to ask an uncomfortable question? How can we help support people so that they don't feel so isolated and so kind of on display? And so we basically gave her a scenario. She had to go into this place and ask some really uncomfortable questions about, my husband and I are having these problems. Can you help me with X, Y, and Z? Now, if you don't know Good Vibes, they actually have fantastic customer service. You go in and it doesn't feel skeezy. There's really nice people talking to you. They make you feel okay. And yet, even in this really supportive environment, she was just like sweating bullets, panicked, like super awkward. It was an awful experience. Again, how do you help translate that empathy to someone else? We can't just electively have surgery so that we can understand what it's like. We can't develop diabetes so that we can understand how do you support somebody who has diabetes. So what you can do is, again, look at analogs. Pull out pieces of the experience that you could learn from that are important pieces of the experience, not frivolous pieces. So our colleague, Alte, he was doing a project on wound care, and he needed to understand pain management and how you really, help support this experience so that it wasn't so painful. So he got his chest waxed. If you don't know Alte, no offense, Alte, Alte's kind of hairy. Like, this is a really painful experience, but they learned a lot. They learned that, cooling the room matters, making it a little darker space, getting people comfortable, it makes a difference. Bill Moggridge is one of the founders of IDEO, and his quote is, "The only way to experience an experience is to experience it." So I encourage you, go out there, try and experience things yourself, get a sense of what the priorities are, and pick something. Don't try and design for all the needs, because you can't design for all the needs. There's too many needs. Pick the ones that are most relevant to the challenge at hand. And I say go forth and be empathetic. Thank you.
We're going to take a few questions. We have a little bit of time for questions. Christopher Snyder is providing me with questions virtually, well, if you call this virtually. And a shout out to Sarah Kucharski and Britt Johnson, who are also playing roles in this process. Any question from the audience here in the room? Question? Anybody? No? I have a question to start things off. What if you work for an organization that doesn't really buy into this empathy development stuff?
Oh, that's an easy question.
What do you do to turn them around?
I'd say one thing that first off, you got to have an advocate. You got to have somebody on your side who does support you, because it's hard to be the lone voice of empathy. So find a teammate, find a buddy, find somebody who can kind of help block and tackle. But the best thing you can do is, if you can't get somebody to try and experience themselves, find ways to bring that experience into the environment. So can you capture stories and just make posters and hang them up, or start to seed stories throughout your other colleagues?
Yeah, good advice. Any questions here yet? Yes, go.
Question: how do you reconcile designing for, say, physicians? How do you reconcile designing for physicians versus the patients? The physician has to put the device in. You want to make it easy for them. You want to make them comfortable using your device, versus the patient, who is the end user, and it may not be the same goal. Do you ever have that happen?
All the time, yeah. And it's on a horrible, unsatisfying answer is it depends. It really depends on what we're designing. Is the patient going to be awake, or are they going to be, an active participant in this process? But one thing that is really useful is to actually bring the different stakeholders together and have them co-create an experience. Actually have them work through and prototype. What should the patient interact, and how do they want to interact with this experience, and does that get in the way of what the surgeon's trying to do? And you can do a lot of interesting stuff with prototyping and role playing and that sort of thing, but it gets a really interesting dialogue going that wouldn't normally happen.
Let me provide a question. This is a question from Amy Campbell. What is the best way to maintain trust relationships over time to keep design empathic, and relevant?
Oh, that's a good question. Is that for the patient? Is that for who? Send follow-up.
Send a follow, Amy.
Okay, so I'm gonna go with how do we keep empathy in the team, or kind of like consistent in the team throughout. I'm gonna interpret it that way.
Okay.
I think it helps to have to bring a lot of people along in the process, so that you're not the keeper of the stories. So you're not the one who's having to kind of always raise your hand and say, but the user. So often what we'll do is we'll try and create experiences that allow more people into this process and more people to develop that empathy. So when we're in, maybe we're developing a digital tool. Suddenly the IT guy is defending the patient or defending the end user, as opposed to it being a battle.
Yeah.
And so a lot of that happens with storytelling. A lot of that happens with continuing to go back out and just refresh that muscle.
Great answer. I'm going to say hello to a couple of people out there. Dr. Jesse Fan from Oregon, watching from Dallas. Courage Sings from British Columbia, Canada. Philip Jeffrey from Vancouver. Katie Schuler from Boston. Marcy Mom in Singapore, just a sample of the people tuning us in out there in the world. Questions here? Yes.
Hi, how exactly do you recruit people to talk to, especially with uncomfortable issues that they might not even be comfortable talking to their families about? Do you financially incentivize them, or how does that process work?
That's a question, and that's going to also depend on the project and the kind of challenge it is. But we've done everything from tapping into patient groups, patient advocacy groups, where they have access to patients who might be willing to participate, or they would know the right kind of person if it's like a needle in a haystack kind of person. We've also we've used recruiters, friends and family. Friends and family are something that we used to use a lot more, and now I think we're balancing it more. And then sometimes, if it's not just a patient or if it's a stakeholder, we'll have clients help us find these people. But we tend to give pretty specific descriptions of what we're looking for. So we're not looking for demographics, we're actually looking for behaviors. Somebody who believes this, or somebody who exhibits this kind of behavior in this kind of setting, and people self-identify. And then your second question was, do we pay them? We absolutely pay them, because they're contributing to a process where we're making something that somebody's going to make money off of. And we also want to really give respect to the fact that they're giving their time and such personal energy. So we actually pay pretty well.
Yes, here we go. A question coming up. There we go.
I was just wondering about empathy in terms of usability and removing any friction in terms of using the product that you're trying to create, a product or service.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of companies, when they're kind of marrying the for-profit motive to being able to design better products, are willing to go a certain distance to use empathy so that they can design for adoption and discovery and retention and engagement. Mm-hmm. But then at what point does a model actually take into consideration what these designers know is almost too much of a good thing, or too much of what the user wants?
Can you give me an example of what too much of a good thing is?
So assuming, like, let's say it is a food company, mm-hmm. right? Maybe they're designing, food that tastes great and is cheap and efficient and economical and everything, but perhaps it isn't quite doing so much good for the user from their long-term health, whether it's like lifestyle diseases,
yeah.
or loaded with sugar and fat and whatever else. So yeah, we're designing for empathy so the product sells like there's no tomorrow, but how does it all circle back? So we know if we were truly user-centric, then we would maybe pause to wonder about what the long-term consequences
I think I'd probably take a hard look at maybe kind of who you're putting in that pool, because I think maybe there's two ways to answer that. One is, I know that a lot of my colleagues, both inside of IDEO and former colleagues outside of IDEO, we actually believe really strongly in trying to have an impact, positive impact on the world. And so there's automatically a filter of the kind of work we want to do and we believe in doing. And there's always a tension, right? Because clients have to pay us and they have to put products out into the world. And there's a lot of back and forth in helping clients see another way forward, right? If your product is always, you've always made money on a product that, I'm not going to name anybody because we work for everybody. But if you make a product that historically does get people less healthy, is there a way to start to open their eyes to, hey, there is this growing awareness of engaging people in their health by offering better choices in the store? And there's a lot of going back and forth and investing in relationship over the long term with clients to help them see new opportunities for revenue. I don't know if that answers your question, but it's an ongoing debate, and I think even internally we definitely have a lot of soul searching questions around, do we want to work with this client, and how can we nudge this towards good?
Here's a related question, a bit of a related question from Chris Schneider. Is there such a thing as too much empathy? How do you know when you may need to step back or distance yourself from a project or a patient or a problem?
Oh, that's a really good question. I'm not even sure how to answer that, but I'll try. So too much empathy. I think maybe too much empathy might be an issue if you lose perspective. If you start to bias yourself maybe towards one perspective and not understand a broader set of users. So for example, maybe biasing yourself towards one extreme type or kind of dialing in for a specific need. Potentially, I'm sure there's an answer with too much empathy in being involved, but I just can't imagine it. I haven't seen that.
Yeah. Hey, another question from out there. Do all large healthcare organizations have to have a buy-in for including empathy in design?
Do all large healthcare organizations, does the entire organization have to have buy-in?
What do large healthcare organizations, which are out there, do they all have buy-in already? What's your experience?
We're seeing a lot of wonderful things happen. We're seeing we're getting clients that are small health organizations and large health organizations, and they're actually coming and they're much more interested in human-centered design and actually designing with experience in mind. Part of that is because the policy world has changed. Part of that is it's financially going to start hitting them a lot harder, so they have to care about it. But we're starting to see higher and higher up in the organization a willingness to include patients and staff members and stakeholders in a process, and also give their teams and their staff members design thinking capabilities. I mean, every week I'm on a project or touching a project that has to do with kind of helping an organization like learn how to do this themselves. Yeah, it's pretty awesome.
You talked about focusing on extreme users. Is there ever an appropriate time to focus on non-extreme users, the typical user? When is that?
Absolutely. I think extreme users are useful for inspiration. I think they're useful in kind of helping you think through or think around a problem where maybe you might be stuck, or you might need some fresh thinking, right? If you just only focus on the core, you might not get to very innovative stuff. You might not get to new ways of thinking about the problem. You could explore and discover new lenses and new perspectives in. There's definitely a lot of projects where I've spent a lot of time just going deep with the core users to just understand, just information, like what is it like to have this experience, and how could we make it better? So, yeah.
Any more questions here? Yeah. We have a couple of questions. Take your pick. Here we go.
Hi. So if you've already sort of started the traditional process of developing a product, and then you sort of are really sort of taken by design thinking, is it too late to incorporate that into an existing traditional sort of design or development process?
It's never too late. You can always bring somebody in, whatever you're designing, take it out to somebody, put it in front of them, and ask them to interact with it. I mean, if it's a tangible product, then you can ask them to interact with it. One thing that can help if you've already designed something is to maybe create another parallel so that you can give people something to compare to. So I didn't talk too much about prototyping because I know there's a whole class on prototyping and feedback, but you can absolutely take something that exists out. You could also compare it to something that exists in the marketplace that's comparable and get people to talk about maybe their experience of using both or how they expect it could work. But it's never, ever, ever too late to bring people in.
Could you pass it up here? I think there's a question up front.
It's probably sometimes too late, but Twitter's going to zing me on that one.
Final question.
Kind of going back to your comment on extreme behavior, when you're designing for particular extremes of a population, how do you choose which extreme behaviors to focus on? Or, yeah, I guess that would be it.
Yeah. I think that's part of the synthesis process. And the way I describe design or the design process to people is that it's a team sport. And so part of this is about, you're taking people from your team out so you have these shared experiences together. And ideally, you guys don't all have the same point of view, right? So I'm going out with engineers and communications designers, and we're hearing these stories and seeing these interactions, and we're going to come up with our own point of view. And in storytelling and synthesis, we'll extract what we think the highest priorities are, and that's what you jump off of for the extremes. You don't just pick extremes out of the air of like, it could be fun to talk to a sailor who's like boating lobsters. It's like, if that's not relevant to the challenge, it's just a field trip. And so it is a negotiation. It's a wrestling kind of experience with the content, and synthesis is the hardest part of the process.
But it's just the most fun.
It's the best.
We're out of time for questions, but so thank you very much, Amy. Really, really wonderful. Thank you, Larry. Thank you, Stanford. We'll see you next week. Thank you. Excellent. Thank you.
Those were hard questions. Thank you. Those are so hard.
Thanks so much for joining us tonight for this episode of Stanford Medicine X Live. We'll see you back here on April 15th, 2014 at 5:30 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, when we'll discuss the topic Healthcare Costs, moderated by Britt Johnson with a panel of e-patient leaders. You won't want to miss this next episode of Stanford Medicine X Live. As a reminder, this program is made possible by support from the Stanford University School of Medicine, Department of Anesthesia, Stanford AIM Lab, Stanford Hospital and Clinics, and the Agency for Healthcare Research Quality. If you haven't yet done so, please take a moment to like our Facebook page at www.facebook.com/Stanford MedX so you can continue the conversation online and stay informed of program updates. From all of us here at Stanford Medicine X, we want to thank you for joining us today and remind you to join us again next Thursday, April 17th at 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time for another edition of Stanford Medicine X Live, featuring a new healthcare design class from the Stanford University School of Medicine called Design for Health. Next week, we are featuring a class on design for wearability with Matthew Diamond from Misfit Wearables and ePatient speaker and moderator Christopher Snyder. Online activities are a great way for those of you in our class or at home to participate and join in the online discussion around design for health. Don't forget to join us on Tumblr and participate in this week's online activity. Interview someone in your life about a healthcare challenge or service experience that they have had. You may use video, audio, or text for your interviews. Then post it on Tumblr with your friend's permission using the MedX hashtag, or submit a post through our Tumblr website, and we'll make sure to include it on our class website. Also, please don't forget that registration for Medicine X 2014 is now open. Don't miss the year's premier patient-centered conference on emerging technology and medicine. Unique opportunities such as our masterclass program and our IDEO Design Challenge workshop have extremely limited space availability. You'll want to take advantage of these programs while our early bird registration pricing is still available until May 1st, 2014. For all of you out there taking time to tune in with us tonight, thank you for joining us and being part of the conversation. A special thanks to our guest panelists this evening. From all of us at Stanford Medicine X, we'll see you next time.